The stagecoach pulled into Redemption Creek on a Tuesday afternoon in the blazing summer of 1878, and the only passenger who stepped down onto the cracked, sun-baked earth was a young woman with no luggage, no companion, and nothing in her hands but a Bible so old and worn that its leather cover had faded to the color of pale sand. Every man on the main street of Redemption Creek, Texas, stopped what he was doing. The blacksmith's hammer paused mid-swing. The barber leaned out of his doorway with a razor still in his hand. 3 cowboys sitting outside the Dusty Rose Saloon tilted their hats back and stared with open curiosity, because women did not arrive alone in Redemption Creek. Women arrived with husbands, with fathers, with brothers who carried rifles and wore the kind of expression that told every man in town to keep his eyes forward. They did not arrive like this, like a dust-colored sparrow dropped from a cloudless sky, blinking against the light with wide brown eyes, and a set to her jaw that suggested she was far more frightened than she was willing to let anyone see. Her dress was the blue of a sky that had been washed too many times. Her dark hair was pinned up neatly beneath a bonnet that had seen better years, but was still clean, still straight, still worn with a kind of dignity that caught the attention even before her face did. She was perhaps 22 years old, and she had the look of someone who had traveled a very long way and was still not entirely certain she had arrived at the right place. She stood beside the stagecoach and pressed the Bible against her chest with both hands and looked up at the painted wooden sign above the general store that read Redemption Creek, Pop. 312, and something moved across her face. Relief, maybe, or the particular exhaustion of someone who has finally allowed themselves to stop running. Jesse Calloway was 27 years old and had been leaning against the post outside the land office for the better part of an hour, waiting for the county assessor to return from his lunch when the stagecoach arrived. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples where the sweat gathered beneath his hat brim. He had an honest face, not handsome in the showy way of the men who gambled in the saloon, but the kind of face that people trusted, with laugh lines beginning at the corners of his gray eyes and a jaw that spoke of stubbornness without cruelty. He had been ranching the land northeast of town for 3 years, alone since his father had died of fever the previous spring, and he had grown accustomed to the particular silence of a man who works hard and comes to town only when he must. He watched the young woman step down from the stagecoach with the Bible held against her heart, and something he could not immediately name shifted inside his chest. The stagecoach driver handed something down to her, an envelope, it looked like, and she opened it, read it, and then closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, she folded the envelope carefully, tucked it inside the Bible, and squared her shoulders. She looked up and down the street with the deliberate calm of someone who has had to learn calm the hard way, and then she began walking toward the general store. She had not taken 4 steps before Roy Duggan stepped out from in front of the saloon and planted himself in her path with the particular confidence of a man who has never had to be told to move out of the way. Roy Duggan was 35 and had the kind of broad, weathered face that might have been handsome once, but had since been rearranged by years of rough living into something that looked permanently annoyed. He worked odd jobs around town and drank with a dedication that most men reserved for religion. "Now where are you headed in such a hurry, darling?" he said, and there was a thickness in his voice that suggested the Dusty Rose had been open for him since before noon. The young woman stopped. She did not step back, which Jesse noted. She simply stopped and looked at Roy Duggan with those calm brown eyes and said, "I need to speak with the postmaster, if you would be so kind as to let me pass." The postmaster. Roy repeated it like it was a funny word. "What business does a pretty girl have with the postmaster?" "My own business," she said, and her voice was steady, but Jesse, even from across the street, could see the white of her knuckles against the cover of the Bible. He was already moving before he had decided to move. He crossed the street in 6 long strides, came up beside the young woman, and said to Roy Duggan in the even, unhurried tone that he used when he needed something to stop without making it into a scene, "Roy, that's enough." Roy looked at him. There was a moment that could have gone several ways, and then Roy looked away, because Roy Duggan had enough sense left in him to know that Jesse Calloway was not a man who said things twice, and that the look currently on Jesse's face was the same look his father had worn just before he put a boot so far up a man's fortunes that the man reconsidered his life choices entirely. "Just being friendly," Roy muttered, and moved aside. Jesse turned to the young woman. Up close, she was prettier than he had noticed from across the street, which surprised him, because he had already noticed she was very pretty from across the street. There was a cut above her left eyebrow, half-healed, that someone had tried to treat with care. Her eyes were the color of dark honey, and they were looking at him, now with a wariness that he recognized as someone who had learned not to trust too quickly. "Thank you," she said. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and then, as if honesty had slipped past her guard before she could stop it, "I think so." "The post office is 2 doors down on the right," he said. "Tom Hennessy runs it. He's a decent man." She nodded, looked at the Bible in her hands, and then looked back up at him. "My name is Clara Ashworth," she said. It was offered carefully, like something she was testing the safety of giving away. "Jesse Calloway," he said. He touched the brim of his hat. "Welcome to Redemption Creek." She almost smiled. It was close enough that he counted it. Then she thanked him again and walked the 2 doors down to the post office, and Jesse stood in the street for longer than was strictly necessary, watching the door close behind her. Clara Ashworth had, in fact, arrived with almost nothing. She had arrived with the Bible, which had belonged to her mother and her grandmother before that, and which had verses underlined in 3 different hands and pressed wildflowers between its pages that had long since faded to brown. She had arrived with the dress on her back, and the clothes she wore beneath it, and the thin cotton one she had folded into the worn carpet bag that the stagecoach driver had passed down to her along with the envelope. She had $4.70 to her name, a silver thimble her mother had given her, and the address of a man named Gerald Ashworth, her father's older brother, who had written to her 6 weeks ago in St. Louis to say that he had land and work and a room for her, and that family was family and she should come. The letter from Tom Hennessy, the postmaster, who was indeed a decent man with reading spectacles and kind, tired eyes, was not good news. Gerald Ashworth had suffered a stroke 3 weeks past. He was alive but diminished, largely confined to his bed, and his ranch was being run by a hired hand named Patterson who, Tom Hennessy said carefully, and with the diplomacy of a man who weighs his words, was not known for his Christian nature. Clara sat in the wooden chair beside Tom's desk and listened to all of this without interrupting, which Tom later told his wife was one of the more remarkable things he had witnessed in 20 years of delivering bad news, because most people, when they hear the bottom has fallen out of their plans, make some kind of sound. When he finished, Clara opened the Bible on her lap and straightened the folded letter inside it and then folded her hands over the cover. "Is there a boarding house in town?" she asked. Tom pushed his spectacles up. "Mrs. Holt keeps a room or 2. She's on Elm Street, the yellow house. She's fair." "And is there work? I can sew and I can cook and I can read and write." Tom thought about it carefully, which Clara appreciated more than false reassurance. "Millicent Brewer at the dress shop sometimes needs help with alterations. She's been talking about it. And the school teacher, Mr. Warren, he's been asking around for someone who can assist him with the younger children. He only has the 1 room. I'll speak to both of them," Clara said, and stood up and thanked him and walked out into the afternoon sun, and the street was still hot and still strange, and she still had no uncle who could offer her the safety she had traveled 400 miles to reach, but she had a boarding house and the possibility of work and the worn Bible, and she had survived worse than this. She knew she had survived worse than this. What she did not know was that Jesse Calloway had waited outside the post office, sitting on the bench with his hat in his hands, because he had gone to the land office and done his business and come back out and found himself standing in front of the post office before he had fully reasoned out why. He told himself it was because a woman alone in a frontier town with no one to meet her was the kind of situation that decent men did not simply walk away from. He told himself this firmly and with some conviction. He was not entirely certain he believed it. When Clara came out, she found him there and stopped with a look that was half surprised and half something else he could not read. "The news was not good," he said. It was not a question. She considered him for a moment. "My uncle is unwell," she said. "I will be staying in town for the time being." "Mrs. Holt's boarding house," he said, "on Elm Street. The postmaster told me. She's a fair woman." He stood and put his hat back on. "Do you have a way to get your bag there?" She glanced at the small, sorry carpetbag at her feet. "I can carry it." "I know you can," he said, which made something shift in her expression in a way he hoped was good. "I meant that I'd be glad to carry it if you wouldn't mind the company." There was a moment, he would remember it later with a clarity that surprised him, the way the afternoon light came sideways down the street and caught the dust motes rising around them. And then she said, "All right, Mr. Calloway." "Jesse," he said. "All right, Jesse," she said. He carried her bag to Elm Street and she walked beside him, and they talked about things that people talk about when they are strangers but feeling carefully toward something else. He told her how long he had been in Redemption Creek and something about his ranch, the Calloway place, though he said it plainly without the boasting that she was braced for and that other men seemed to consider attractive. She told him she had come from St. Louis, that her parents were both gone, that her father had passed 2 years ago, and her mother 3 years before that she had been working as a seamstress and living with a cousin whose husband had recently and politely suggested that the arrangement was no longer convenient. She said this last part without bitterness or self-pity, just the plain statement of a woman who has had to adapt to circumstances and has learned to do so without waste, and Jesse felt something sharpen in his admiration for her, and at the same time a clean anger at the cousin's husband, whom he had never met and never would, for making a young woman alone feel unwelcome in the only home she had. Mrs. Holt was a stout, capable woman in her late 50s who looked Clara up and down with the frankness of someone who does not have time for pretense, and then nodded and said the room was 50 cents a week, breakfast and supper included, and that she expected her boarders to be in by 9 and to comport themselves with decency. Clara said that sounded entirely fair. Mrs. Holt looked at Jesse in a way that was equal parts appreciation and speculation and said, "You look like you're not lost, Jesse Calloway," which Jesse chose to interpret as a compliment. He left Clara at Mrs. Holt's door and walked back to where his horse, a solid roan named Copper, was tied in front of the land office. He untied the horse and stood for a moment with his hand on the saddle horn, and the late afternoon sun pulling long shadows across the street, and he thought about a pair of brown eyes and a worn Bible held against a chest with a white-knuckled grip, and the steadiness of a voice that was frightened but would not show it, and he felt something in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time and was not entirely sure what to do with. He rode home and fed the horses and made his supper and sat on the porch in the long blue dusk, and he thought about Clara Ashworth. She spent the first 3 days in Redemption Creek finding her footing, which she did with the systematic efficiency of someone who has learned that panic is a luxury she cannot afford. She secured 2 afternoons a week at Millicent Brewer's dress shop, helping with alterations and some of the finer handwork that Millicent, whose eyes were beginning to trouble her, found difficult. The pay was modest, but it was money. She spoke to Mr. Warren, the schoolteacher, a nervous, earnest young man from Ohio who seemed grateful enough at the prospect of help with the younger children that he nearly shook her hand off. That would begin Monday. She visited her Uncle Gerald at the ranch on the second day, riding out in the wagon with Tom Hennessy, who made the trip on town business and offered her the seat. The ranch was a reasonable piece of land, perhaps not flourishing but not ruined, and her uncle was indeed diminished. He sat in his chair by the window and recognized her and held her hand, and said her mother's name twice before saying hers, and wept a little, which she bore with her cheek against his gray head and her hand moving on his back in slow circles. The hired hand Patterson was a lean, watchful man who looked at her with an expression she did not like, but could not specifically object to, and said that the old man was being looked after and that she needn't trouble herself. She troubled herself anyway. She came every Wednesday, which quickly became the arrangement, and she helped with the cooking and the mending and talked to her uncle in the slow, careful way that he could follow, and she watched Patterson with those calm brown eyes and quietly catalogued everything she saw. She did not see Jesse until the Sunday morning church service, 4 days after her arrival. Redemption Creek had a small white church at the north end of the main street, and nearly the whole of the town turned out each Sunday because the preacher, Reverend Aldous Marsh, was the kind of preacher who spoke in plain, warm language about grace and mercy, and did not spend much time on wrath, which made him well liked. Jesse was in the third pew on the right, with his hat on his knee, and he saw her come in with Mrs. Holt and stood slightly in the way that men do when they stand for a woman in church, which is not quite standing but is something, and she saw him and the corners of her mouth moved. After the service, in the particular social hour that happens in churchyards on Sunday mornings, when people shake hands and pass news and the children run between the adults' legs, Jesse made his way toward her with the kind of focused casualness that everyone in the churchyard noticed and pretended not to. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning, Jesse," she said. "How are you settling in?" "Better than I expected," she said, and he could see that she meant it and it pleased him to hear it. "Mrs. Holt has been very kind, and Mr. Warren at the school is quite happy to have an extra pair of hands. You'll be teaching, helping with the younger ones, reading and letters, some arithmetic. You went to school yourself." She looked at him with a mild amusement that he found devastating. "Yes, Jesse, I went to school." "I didn't mean it like that," he said, and she laughed, which was the first time he had heard her laugh, a clear, genuine sound that she seemed surprised by herself, as if it had escaped before she thought about it. "I know you didn't," she said. "My mother believed very strongly in education. She taught me herself before there was a proper school, and then she walked me to the schoolhouse every day until I was old enough to go alone. She sounds like a fine woman." The amusement softened into something quieter. She was. He asked if she would like to walk a little, since the day was fine and neither of them was in immediate haste, and she said that she would. They walked along the road that curved behind the church, toward the small grove of cottonwoods that grew along the creek bank, and the town fell away behind them, and the morning was cool and bright and smelled of grass and warm earth. They talked the way that people talk when they have discovered that talking to each other is a pleasure and are still slightly astonished by it. He told her about the ranch, about the cattle and the horses, and the way the land looked in early spring before the heat came, the green that lasted only a few weeks before the summer baked it to gold. She told him about St. Louis, about the river and the way it smelled and the brick buildings, and the market on Saturday mornings, and he listened with the full attention of a man who is genuinely interested in the life of the person speaking. She was sitting on the bank of the creek with her hands in her lap and the Bible, which she carried even to church simply out of habit, resting beside her, when she said, without particularly planning to, "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask me anything," he said, and he meant it. "Why did you wait outside the post office that day?" He was quiet for a moment. A yellow bird moved in the cottonwood above them. The creek made its small, constant sound. "Because you were alone," he said, "and you had just gotten news that was not good, and I thought someone should be nearby in case." "In case of what?" "In case you needed something." She looked at the creek. "I didn't need anything," she said. "I know," he said. "But I didn't know that yet." She looked at him then, and the look was long and honest, and he bore it without flinching, because whatever she was weighing, he wanted the weight to be true. Then she nodded, very slightly, and looked back at the creek, and they sat together in the comfortable silence of two people who have moved, without quite deciding to, from being strangers to being something else. 2 weeks passed in the way that meaningful time does in young love, each day carrying its ordinary hours and its particular, extraordinary moments. Jesse found reasons to come to town more often than he strictly needed to. He was not subtle about it, and he did not try to be, and the town of Redemption Creek, which noticed everything and discussed it freely, noticed and discussed it with warmth, because Jesse Calloway was well liked, and because the young woman from St. Louis had already, in her quiet, capable way, begun to make herself part of the fabric of the place. She helped Mrs. Holt's neighbor, an elderly man named Mr. Prout, write a letter to his daughter in Kansas City, which the man had been putting off for 8 months because his hands shook too badly to hold a pen. She read to the younger children at the school with a gift for voices and for keeping small people interested that made Mr. Warren shake his head in grateful wonder. She sat with the women at the Wednesday sewing circle that met at the church and listened more than she spoke at first, and then gradually, by degrees, began to speak. And they found that she was funny in a dry, understated way that crept up on you, and that she had opinions that were thoughtful, and that she stated with a diffident confidence that they found admirable. Jesse came into town on a Thursday with a fence repair to complete and found her at Millicent Brewer's shop. And Millicent, who had the social instincts of a woman who has been matchmaking since before either of them was born, said she was absolutely certain she needed a bolt of canvas from the hardware store, and could Jesse possibly take Clara with him, since she knew precisely what weight of canvas was required, and Millicent's knee was troubling her today. Clara raised one eyebrow at Millicent, because Clara was not foolish, and Millicent met her gaze with perfect innocence, and Clara put on her bonnet and went with Jesse to the hardware store, and Millicent watched them from the window and felt entirely justified. They walked back from the hardware store slowly. The bolt of canvas was tucked under Jesse's arm, and neither of them was thinking about canvas. He told her about a horse he had been working with, a young gray mare that had been spooked so badly before he got her that she still trembled when she heard loud sounds, but was beginning to trust him. He said it with a tenderness that he was not self-conscious about, the way that people who are genuinely good with animals talk about them, and Clara listened and thought about the patience that implied. "What made you want a ranch?" she asked. He considered it. "My father," he said. "He had the land and he worked it hard, and I grew up watching him love it. It wasn't always easy. There were hard years, but there was something about belonging to a piece of ground. About knowing it and making something grow on it. I don't know how to explain it better than that." "You explained it very well," she said. He looked at her sideways. "What about you? What did you want when you were young?" No one had asked her that in a very long time. She was quiet for a moment. "I wanted to teach," she said. "I wanted to have a schoolroom of my own. I used to line up my mother's kitchen chairs and teach my imaginary students." She paused. "Then things happened and wanting things became complicated. And now," she looked ahead down the street, "now I am trying to want things again," she said. "I think it takes practice after a while, wanting things." He stopped walking. She took another step before she realized, and turned back to look at him. He was standing in the middle of the street with the canvas under his arm and looking at her with an expression that was so open and unguarded that it caught her breath. "Clara," he said, and stopped. "Jesse," she said. "I'd like to—" He stopped again, shifted the canvas. He was not a man who stammered, but he was a man who wanted to get this right, which she saw and which moved her considerably. "Would you be willing to spend some time with me? Not town business, not the hardware store. Just time." She looked at him for a moment, and the wanting that she had said was hard to get back to stirred in her chest like something waking from a long sleep. "I would like that," she said. He smiled. It was a full smile, unguarded, and it changed his face entirely, and she looked at it and thought, in the clear, specific way of a very honest person acknowledging something true, that she was in a great deal of trouble. Sunday afternoons became their time. After church, After the social hour, they would ride out to the creek or walk the road north of town or sit on the bench outside the land office where he had first waited for her, and they would talk for the long golden hours of a Texas Sunday afternoon, while the shadows lengthened and the mockingbirds argued in the mesquite. He learned her in increments, the way you learn a landscape by walking it slowly. He learned that she read voraciously, and that the Bible she carried was not merely a comfort object, but a text she knew deeply and thought about hard, and was not afraid to argue with, which he found startling and wonderful in equal measure. He learned that she had a temper that came in very quick and very short, like summer lightning, and was gone before most people noticed it, and that it came when she saw someone treated unjustly. He learned that she cried easily but was ashamed of it and tried to hide it, and that she grieved for her mother with a quiet, persistent ache that surfaced in the way she went still sometimes when she was not thinking about being watched. She learned him. She learned that he was meticulous with the things he cared about, his horses, his tools, his few friendships, and indifferent to the things he did not care about in a way that was not laziness but priority. She learned that he had read more than she expected, that the small shelf in the ranch house had a worn copy of Shakespeare and a battered history of the Mexican War, and a collection of poetry he said had been his mother's, which she pressed him on until he admitted that he had read it, and that he did not entirely see why a man was supposed to be embarrassed by that. She learned that he woke before dawn and that he found the hour before sunrise to be the best part of the day, which she understood completely, which surprised them both. He took her to the ranch on a Saturday, with Mrs. Holt as chaperone, which was the proper arrangement and which Mrs. Holt undertook with transparent glee. The Calloway place was not grand, a solid, well-maintained house of wood and plaster, a good barn, 3 paddocks, the pasture land rolling away to the northeast where the cattle were visible as small dark shapes in the distance. But it had a porch that faced west for the sunsets, and a kitchen garden that had been started by his mother, and that he had kept going with diligent if sometimes uncertain effort, and a cottonwood tree in the yard that was tall and old and whose sound in the wind was one of those sounds that Clara found, almost immediately, that she wanted to hear again. She met the gray mare that he had told her about, whose name was Silver, and stood quietly at the paddock fence and waited the way he had told her to wait, and after perhaps 10 minutes the mare came slowly and tentatively to the fence and pressed her nose against Clara's offered hand, and Clara felt the warm breath on her palm and held absolutely still, and Jesse, watching from beside her, felt something solidify in his chest in a way that had the quality of permanence. "She trusts you," he said. "She trusts that I'm not going to hurt her," Clara said. "That's the beginning of trust." He looked at her. She was watching the mare, her fingers moving lightly along the velvet nose, her face soft in the late morning light. "Yes," he said, "it is." She turned to find him watching her with that open, unguarded expression again, and neither of them looked away. That was the day he told her about his father. They were sitting on the porch steps after the noon meal, with Mrs. Holt very deliberately dozing in the rocking chair on the far end of the porch, and he told her about his father and how he had died, the fever that had come quickly and taken him before anyone could properly rail against it, and how the ranch had felt after, like a place with the center removed. He said it quietly and without the performance of grief but with the authentic weight of it, the missing that does not shout but settles. She listened without trying to fix it, which he had noticed was her particular gift, the ability to receive someone's grief without rushing to make it smaller. When he was done she said, "He sounds like he was a good man." "He was the best man I knew," Jesse said. "I'm trying to be half of what he was." "I think you're doing better than half," she said, and the simplicity and certainty of it undid him in a way that all the elaborate comfort in the world could not have. He was in love with her. He had been for some time. He sat on the porch step with his shoulder 2 inches from her shoulder, and the afternoon light falling warm across them both, and he knew it with the clean, irreversible certainty of a man who has been careful about what he gives his heart to and is no longer able to be careful because it is already given. He did not say any of this immediately, because they had known each other less than a month, and he was a man who believed that important things deserved to be approached with both care and courage, and that meant waiting until both conditions were met. Clara's trouble with Patterson at the ranch did not wait for a convenient time. She had been watching him for 3 weeks, the way the ranch accounts were kept, or rather not kept, the way the cattle numbers did not quite match what her uncle had told her in his clearer moments. She was not yet certain enough to say anything, but she was certain enough to be looking, and Patterson had noticed that she was looking. On a Wednesday afternoon in early September, she arrived at the ranch for her weekly visit and found that her uncle had been moved from his room with the window to the back room, which was smaller and darker, and had no cross-ventilation, which was cruelty of a particular kind in the September heat of Texas, and she said so to Patterson directly, and without any of the diplomatic framing she had been using around him. Patterson looked at her for a long, flat moment. He was a lean man, not tall but with a coiled quality to him, and he said, "The old man's room needed to be used for storage. I don't see that it's any concern of yours." "Gerald Ashworth is my uncle," she said, "and this is his ranch, and it is entirely my concern." "You're a girl without land, without money, and without a name in this county," Patterson said, and his voice had dropped to something quieter and more dangerous than a shout. "You do well to remember that." She stood her ground and looked at him steadily with those brown eyes, but her heart was hammering. "I'll be speaking to the county sheriff," she said, "about the accounts." She should not have said that yet. She knew at the moment it was out of her mouth. She had not yet gathered enough evidence, and she had given him warning. But she said it because the back room with no windows in September was an injustice she could not swallow without speaking. She moved her uncle back to his proper room before she left, with the help of the old ranch cook, a woman named Dorothea who was 70 years old and had not a single fear of Patterson or anyone else. And then she rode back to town with Tom Hennessy, who came for her at 5, and she was very quiet on the ride back, which was not her usual way. She told Jesse on Sunday. She had been intending to handle it herself. She had been handling things herself for a long time, and there was a part of her that found it difficult to lay a burden down, because she had never been entirely sure that someone else would pick it up. But she told him, watching his face as she did, and he listened to the whole of it with the focused attention he gave to things that mattered. When she finished, his jaw was set. Not with anger at her, she could see that clearly, but with the particular controlled anger of a man who has heard something unjust. "I know the county sheriff," he said. "Ben Harker. He's a good man, not the kind to be bought." "I don't have proof yet," she said. "I have observations. I'm not sure that's enough." "Tell me what you've seen," he said, "and I'll tell you if it's enough to bring to Ben," she told him. He listened and asked careful questions, and she saw the moment when his expression shifted from concern to something more focused, because the numbers she was describing did not belong to an honest operation. "Clara," he said, "your uncle could lose that ranch." "I know," she said. "If Patterson has been siphoning cattle and manipulating the accounts, and your uncle has no one watching it, I know," she said again quietly. "I know, Jesse." He reached across and put his hand over hers, which he had not done before, and she looked down at his hand, broad and work-roughened and entirely careful, and then up at his face. "We'll go to Ben Harker tomorrow," he said, "together." That together landed in the space between them with a weight she felt in her whole chest. "You don't have to come," she said. "I know I don't have to," he said. "I want to." Sheriff Ben Harker was a heavy-set man in his mid-50s, with a placid face that concealed a sharp intelligence, and he listened to Clara's account with her Bible open on his desk, because she had written her observations in the margins of the back pages. Dates, numbers, cattle counts, things Patterson had said, which he studied with the careful eyes of a man who knows what evidence looks like when he sees it. "You've been thorough," he said, and in his voice was a respect that she had not been certain he would offer, because women in 1878 Texas did not often walk into sheriff's offices with annotated evidence of embezzlement and expect to be listened to. I had good reason to be, she said. Harker looked at Jesse, who was sitting in the other chair with his hat on his knee. You're vouching for this? Every word, Jesse said. Harker sat back. I'll ride out there tomorrow. I want you to come, Miss Ashworth, because you know where the records are. I'll come, she said. It did not go without incident. When they rode out the next morning, Harker, his deputy, Jesse, and Clara Patterson saw them coming from the porch, and there was a tense, bad quarter of an hour in which he was very clearly calculating odds, and Harker was very clearly patient and unmoved, and Jesse stood a step behind Clara's right shoulder in a way that was quiet but absolute, and Patterson looked at Jesse for a long moment, and something in him decided that the odds were not favorable. He did not run. He stood down, which was ultimately better for everyone. Harker found the records and took them, and found 3 things in the barn that corroborated Clara's numbers, and Patterson was taken into custody, and subsequently stood before the county court, and convicted of fraud and cattle theft, and sentenced to 3 years in the Huntsville State Penitentiary. Gerald Ashworth, when he understood what had happened, and that his ranch was safe, and that it was his niece who had done it, cried in a way that was different from the confused weeping of his diminished days. He cried with clarity and held her face in his shaking hands and said, "Your mother would be so proud." Clara pressed her lips together very hard and said, "I know, Uncle Gerald, I know." The ranch was now in need of proper management, which was a practical problem that required a practical solution. Tom Hennessy helped Clara arrange for a reputable foreman from the next county, a recommendation from the livestock agent, and though it would take time to right what Patterson had damaged, the situation was no longer in crisis. Her uncle had good days and bad days, but the good days were better now, and Dorothea the cook, who was worth more than any hired hand, stayed. Jesse was there for most of it, not in the way of someone inserting himself into another person's story, but in the way of someone who has offered his strength genuinely and is honored that it is accepted. He rode out with Clara on 2 of the trips. He helped move the cattle inventory. He spent an afternoon with the new foreman, Walker, going over the fences and the stock, because he knew cattle and range management and Walker was new to the specific land. Clara watched him with her uncle that afternoon, speaking slowly and kindly, the way he did with the old man, not with the patronizing loudness that some people used but with genuine respect, and felt something move through her so fully and warmly that it left her slightly breathless. The evening they rode back from the ranch after the new foreman was settled and things were properly in motion. The sun was going down in the west in a tremendous theater of gold and amber and deep rose, the kind of sunset that makes the Texas sky look like something that was painted for the purpose of convincing people that the world is beautiful. They rode side by side, the horses at an easy walk, and the light lay across the grass and the road and the sides of their faces, and it was very quiet except for the horses and the birds settling for the night. "Thank you," Clara said. He shook his head slightly. "You did this." "We did this," she said, "and you know the difference." He looked at her in the sideways way that was becoming familiar to her, the quiet, particular attention. "Yes," he said, "I suppose I do." They rode a little further. The sun sank and the sky went to indigo in the east and the first stars appeared, which in Texas in September come out one at a time as if introduced. "Jesse," she said. "Clara," he said. They had stopped. The horses were standing in the road and the last light was going, and there was the extraordinary stillness that comes to open country at the exact moment between day and night, and she was looking at him with those brown eyes that were very large in the dimness and very direct, the way she always was, the way he had loved from the first day, that refusal to look away from what was true. "I am not good at," she stopped, started again. "I have had very little practice at trusting people. I want you to know that it's not a flaw I expect you to fix." "I know," he said. "I'm not trying to fix anything." "I know you're not," she said. "That's why I can tell you." She paused. You have been the kindest person I have met in a very long time, and I find that she stopped again, and the color in her face was not entirely the reflected sunset. I find that I am thinking about you considerably more than is appropriate for someone who is simply a friend. He was very still on his horse. Then slowly, he smiled, and it was the smile that changed his face. The one she had decided early on was among the finer things she had seen. "Well," he said, "that is a considerable relief." She laughed, the clear, surprised laugh that he had been collecting since the first time he heard it. "Is it?" "Because I have been thinking about you considerably more than is appropriate for a friend since approximately the second day you were in Redemption Creek," he said, "and I was beginning to wonder how long I would have to wait before I could say so." She was still smiling. "How long were you prepared to wait?" "As long as it took," he said, and his voice was simple and even and absolute, and she heard in it something that she had not been sure existed in the world in the particular form she had been hoping for, which was a man who meant what he said without qualification or expiration. She reached across the space between the horses and held out her hand, and he took it, and they sat there in the road with their hands joined, and the stars coming out above them and the horses patient in the dark. And it was one of those moments that settles into a person's history as a marker, a before and after, the moment when the shape of the future changed. He rode her back to Mrs. Holt's that night and stood at the gate with his hat in his hands, and she stood on the other side of the gate, and they looked at each other in the lamplight from Mrs. Holt's window, and both of them were very aware of the distance between them, and both of them were content for the moment to let it remain. "Good night, Clara," he said. "Good night, Jesse," she said. She went inside. She sat on the edge of her bed with the Bible on her knees and listened to the night sounds of the town and the distant horses in the livery and the mockingbird that for some reason always sang at 10 o'clock near the cottonwood on Elm Street, and she felt, carefully but unmistakably, happy. It was a feeling she treated with great respect, the way you treat something delicate because it had been scarce and because she had learned not to assume it would last. But it was there, real and warm, and she held it quietly and let it be. October came to the hill country of West Texas in amber and copper, and the air that had been brutal all summer turned cool and sweet, and the days had a clarity and color that made everything look as though it had been rinsed. Jesse came to town twice a week, and they walked and talked and ate supper at Mrs. Holt's table, because Mrs. Holt had made it clear that Jesse Calloway was welcome at her table whenever he liked, which everyone understood to be an endorsement. He kissed her the first time in the cottonwood grove by the creek on a Sunday afternoon in mid-October, when they were sitting on the bank, and she was reading aloud from the Bible not piously, but because it was the text they both knew, and they had been arguing pleasurably about the book of Ruth, which Clara said was fundamentally a story about loyalty and resilience, and Jesse said was fundamentally a love story. "It's both," she finally said, laying the Bible in her lap. "It doesn't have to be one thing." "No," he agreed, "it doesn't have to be one thing." She looked up at him because his voice had changed slightly, and he was very close, and she was not surprised by what happened next, but she was moved by it. The careful quality of it, the way his hand came up to the side of her face as though she were something worth being careful with, the kiss that was not tentative but was not rushed, the way it asked and waited for the answer and found it. When they drew back, she looked at him for a moment, and then she said, with the exact dry understatement that he had come to treasure above most things, "I believe you may have been right about the book of Ruth." He laughed. Out in the open, full and warm, the way she had waited to hear him laugh since before she knew she was waiting for it, and she thought, yes, this is what I was looking for. The weeks that followed had the quality of a story finding its shape. He took her riding, properly, on horseback, not the wagon, on a quiet bay mare named Bess who had none of Silver's skittishness. And they rode over his land in the long, cool mornings, and he showed her the northeast pasture where the grass was best, and the creek that ran through the corner of his property, and the old live oak that he had climbed as a child when his family first came to the land. She told him about the market on Saturday mornings in St. Louis, about the river in winter when it froze in parts, and the cold came up through the city like something alive, about her mother reading to her by lamplight, about the feeling of a first snowfall that she had not had since coming south, and that she missed, unexpectedly, now that the days had turned cold in that sharp Texas way. She was happy. She was genuinely, substantively happy, and she let herself feel it without immediately bracing for its loss, which was progress she noted privately and with some satisfaction. He asked her to marry him in November. He had been thinking about how to do it for a month, which was both like him and unlike him. Like him because he approached important things with deliberateness, unlike him because he was not generally a man who rehearsed. He had gone back and forth about the where and the when and finally decided that the only honest thing was to simply say it when it was true, which it had been for some time. They were in Mrs. Holt's sitting room on a Tuesday evening, which was not a dramatic setting. A lamp on the table, the sound of Mrs. Holt's cat somewhere in the house, a fire in the small stove because the evenings had turned cold, and they had been talking for the past hour with that easiness that had become the primary texture of their time together, and there was a pause that fell naturally in the conversation, and Jesse set down his coffee cup and looked at her. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. Something in his tone had changed, and she was a perceptive woman. "I would like to marry you," he said. "I love you. I believe I have loved you since approximately the second day you were in Redemption Creek, which I told you, but I want to say it now in the context of also saying that I would like to spend the rest of my life with you, if you are willing." She looked at him for a moment that was not a long moment, but that contained, as some moments do, a great deal. The firelight was on his face and his hands were still on the table and he was not performing anything, not nervousness, not confidence, just the plain, honest face of a man who has said what is true and is waiting. "Jesse Calloway," she said. "You are the first person in a very long time who has made me feel like the world is a place where good things are possible." "Is that a yes?" he said, and there was humor in it but real anxiety under the humor which she saw. "Yes," she said. "That is absolutely a yes." He reached across the table and took both her hands in his, and she felt the warm, solid grip of them, and thought of the gray mare pressing her nose into her palm and the beginning of trust, and she turned her hands and held his back just as firmly. Millicent Brewer made the dress, which was a project that consumed 6 weeks, and was the primary topic of conversation at the Wednesday sewing circle for the entire period. Millicent had strong opinions about lace and stronger opinions about fit, and would have gone in an elaborate direction if Clara had not steered it firmly towards simple and beautiful, which they achieved. Ivory cotton with a small eyelet at the neckline and cuffs, fitted through the waist and flaring to a small train, with Clara's dark hair pinned under a veil of fine tulle that had been in Millicent's stock since she could remember and had been waiting, Millicent said, for exactly this purpose. Gerald Ashworth was brought from the ranch for the wedding. He had good days more often than bad days now, and this was his best day in months. He sat in the front pew of the white church in his good coat, which Dorothea had pressed for the occasion, and he held himself very straight, and when Clara came down the aisle on Tom Hennessy's arm, because Tom had been asked and had been so moved by the asking that he'd had to blow his nose before he could accept. Gerald watched her come and his eyes were bright and clear, and when she reached the front, he leaned forward and said her name once, correctly, with love. And she turned to him and pressed his hand before taking Jesse's. Reverend Marsh kept the ceremony warm and plain, the way he kept everything. He talked about the love that endures and about two people choosing each other with clear eyes, and Jesse and Clara stood before him and before the whole of Redemption Creek, and said their vows in clear voices, without looking away from each other. When Jesse said, "I do," his voice was steady and low and entirely certain, and when Clara said hers, it was the same, that steadiness she had worn since the day she stepped off the stagecoach with nothing in her hands but a worn Bible and a set to her jaw that spoke of someone who endures, except that it was not just endurance now. It was something fuller, something chosen. After the ceremony, Reverend Marsh shook Jesse's hand and looked at Clara with a smile that had decades of weddings in it and said, "She arrived with only her faith and her courage, and you recognized the worth of it. That's a good beginning." Jesse looked at Clara beside him, at the veil and the ivory dress and the Bible she had carried even on her wedding day, tucked under her arm now, because it was simply part of her. He thought of the day she had stepped off the stagecoach, nothing in her hands but that worn Bible and that set jaw, and Roy Duggan in her path, and the white of her knuckles and the steadiness of her voice. "She arrived with that Bible," he said to Reverend Marsh, with the plain honesty that was his particular quality, "and I thought that was enough for me." Clara heard him say it. She reached over and took his hand and pressed it once firmly, and he pressed back, and the church was full of their people, and the afternoon light was coming through the tall windows in long bars of gold. The reception was in the churchyard, because it was November and the day was cool and the sky was high and blue and the whole town was there, which was the particular gift of a small frontier town. When it celebrates with everything it has. Mrs. Holt had made 3 pies. Dorothea had ridden in from the ranch with a cake that was nothing short of magnificent given the conditions of its preparation. There was fiddle music and dancing on the packed earth of the churchyard, and Jesse danced with Clara twice, which was the respectably stated number, though the second dance lasted considerably longer than a dance strictly needed to. Gerald Ashworth, seated in his chair at the edge of the dancing, watched his niece dance with her husband in the November light, and his face had the expression of a man who has been given a gift he knows he does not fully deserve, and is grateful for it with his whole heart. They went to the ranch that evening, which was now their ranch, their home. Jesse had spent 3 weeks in the preceding month making it as ready as he could, fresh whitewash on the kitchen walls, new curtains that Mrs. Holt had helped him choose, because he had admitted freely that he had no idea what he was doing. The bedroom made as welcoming as a man who sleeps alone can manage to make it. He had put flowers from the kitchen garden on the table, which were not much in November but were something. Clara walked through the rooms of the house slowly, the way she had walked through the churchyard on the day she arrived in Redemption Creek, deliberately, taking everything in. The sitting room with its shelf of books, the kitchen with its garden window, the bedroom, the porch that faced west. She stood on the porch in the last of the November evening and looked at the land rolling away in the dusk, the cattle somewhere out there in the dark, the cottonwood in the yard whispering in the wind that came from the northwest. Jesse came to stand beside her and she leaned into him, and his arm came around her shoulders, and they stood together on the porch of their house in the last light of their wedding day. "I want to plant a proper kitchen garden in the spring," she said. "More vegetables. I've been thinking about what would grow well here." "Whatever you want," he said, "and I want to keep teaching, at least through the school year. Mr. Warren needs the help." "Of course," he said. She looked up at him. "Is there anything you want?" He looked down at her, and the evening was dark now except for the lamp shining through the window behind them, and she was very close, and her eyes were on his with that direct, honest attention that he had loved since the very first time she turned it on him. "This," he said. "Exactly this." She reached up and touched his face just briefly, the way people touch something to confirm its reality, and then she said, "Then we are in complete agreement." They went inside, and the lamp in the window burned, and the cottonwood moved in the night wind, and the stars above West Texas were enormous and entirely unconcerned with the small, bright, human happiness contained in the house below them. The first year of their marriage was the kind of year that becomes the foundation of everything after it. They learned each other in the full, daily way that is different from courtship, the morning habits, the particular irritations and the patience they required, the rhythms of work and rest, and the long evenings reading by the fire. They discovered that they were compatible in the deep ways that matter and mismatched in the small ways that, properly handled, make life interesting. She thought he was insufficiently communicative when he was worried, which manifested as silence, which she had learned in a harder school to interpret as indifference. He thought she took on too much and did not ask for help soon enough, which she had also learned in a harder school. They said these things to each other directly and without excessive drama, which was the great advantage of two honest people in a marriage, and they made adjustments, and they did not hold the adjustments against each other. She continued teaching at the school through that winter and spring, and in March she was given her own classroom, 2 rooms now, the school having expanded with the town's growth, and she taught the younger children with a gift and a dedication that Mr. Warren spoke of to anyone who would listen. She was known in town as a fair and creative teacher who could make a child love learning in the same way she herself loved it, which had come from her mother and was now being passed forward, which she found both satisfying and, privately, deeply moving. Jesse's ranch grew steadily that year. With Clara's contributions to the household and her sharp eye on the accounts, she kept them now, meticulously, with the same detailed attention she had turned on Patterson's discrepancies. He was able to expand the herd more ambitiously than he had previously managed alone. Walker, the foreman at Gerald's ranch, became a reliable neighbor and sometime help, and the 2 ranches began a cooperative arrangement about shared fencing and water access that benefited both. Gerald Ashworth had one last good spring. He died in April peacefully in his room with the window, with Dorothea holding his hand and Clara on the other side reading from the Bible, the one that had been her mother's, the one with the 3 handwritings and the pressed flowers. He had made his wishes clear in the good days before the bad ones took over fully, and those wishes had been witnessed properly and recorded by the county clerk, and the ranch went to Clara, which was right. Clara grieved her uncle with the same quiet, complete grief she had brought to her parents, a grief she did not rush or perform, but moved through steadily, doing her work and loving her husband and reading her Bible on the porch in the evenings until the sharpest part of it softened into the permanent, bearable ache that she had already learned to carry. He was a good man, she told Jesse one evening. He was not a strong man in the way of the world, but he was good. He wrote to me when everyone else had forgotten. That letter was the reason you came here, Jesse said. Yes. Then I am grateful for it, he said. She smiled. So am I. The 2 ranches were combined in the summer of that first year, which made good practical sense, and which Clara oversaw with the same systematic efficiency she brought to everything. They kept Walker on as foreman for the combined operation and hired 2 additional hands, both of whom Clara interviewed and both of whom reported that the interview had been more thorough than most they had experienced, which they meant as a compliment and which she accepted as one. In August, Clara told Jesse she was expecting. They were in the kitchen garden, which she had expanded in the spring and which was now producing more than they could eat, and which she had begun putting up for winter in the systematic way she had everything else. He was helping her carry the canning jars from the shed, which was domestic and unremarkable, and she set down her jar and said, conversationally but with a slight break in her voice that was not like her, Jesse, I believe we're going to have a child in February. He set down his jars. He looked at her. She was watching him with those brown eyes and the faint color in her face and the Bible, which she had had on the garden bench beside her even for the canning. And he crossed the garden in 3 strides and put his arms around her, and held her with the careful, fierce tenderness of a man who has been given more than he expected and knows the worth of it. She pressed her face into his shoulder and held on, and after a moment he heard the small, wet sound that meant she was crying, which she was still slightly ashamed of, and he said, very quietly, "Don't apologize for that." She laughed against his shoulder, the clear, surprised laugh, and he held her tighter. The pregnancy was uneventful in the main, though she was sick in the mornings for the first 3 months with a thoroughness that she bore with grim, principled stubbornness. She did not stop teaching until December, when the logistics of it became impractical, And by then she had trained a young woman from the eastern end of town who had been helping her to take over the youngest students until she could return. She spent the winter reading more, resting slightly more, continuing the accounts and the correspondence of the ranch operation from the house, and talking to her husband in the long evenings with the ongoing, deepening ease of two people who have discovered that they do not exhaust each other. He was extraordinary during those months. She had not known how to anticipate what kind of man he would be in this particular circumstance, and what he was steady and attentive without being anxious, which was the precise combination she needed, and which she suspected, with the analytical honesty she turned on everything, was more rare than it ought to be. He checked on her without hovering. He did more of the physical work without making her feel diminished by it. He sat with her on the porch in the cold evenings with a blanket over her lap and did not try to talk when she wanted to be quiet and talked when she needed to think out loud and seemed to know the difference without being told, which was a considerable and specific gift. "How do you know?" she asked him once. "Know what?" "When I want quiet and when I want to talk." He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about things. "You get a certain look," he said. "When you want quiet, you're looking out at something. When you want to talk, you're looking at me." She turned and looked at him, and he was smiling. "I'm looking at you now," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know." The baby came on a February night in 1880, during a brief and merciful thaw, with Mrs. Holt in attendance and the midwife from the south end of town, a capable woman named Mrs. Garcia who had been delivering babies in the county for 20 years, and who looked at Clara's set jaw during the long hours of labor, and nodded with a kind of professional appreciation for a woman who does not make unnecessary noise. It was a boy. Jesse Calloway the younger, who came into the world in the small hours of a February morning, with a full head of dark hair and lungs that had clearly not been damaged in transit, and who was placed in his mother's arms in the lamplight of the bedroom, while outside the cottonwood moved in the winter wind. Jesse was in the room. He had not been willing to be elsewhere, and Mrs. Holt had looked at him and Mrs. Garcia had looked at him, and they had both made identical calculations and concluded that he was going to be more trouble outside the room than in it, which was correct. And he watched his wife hold his son in the lamplight, and he felt something that had no particular name in the vocabulary of a cattle rancher in 1880 Texas, but that was, in truth, awe, simple and total. Clara looked up at him, exhausted and luminous, and said, "Come here, Jesse." He came to the bed and sat on the edge of it, and she put the baby in his arms with the careful economy of someone who has just done something extremely difficult and is not entirely certain her arms work properly, and he held his son, the solid, astonishing, improbable reality of his son, and looked at Clara. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. She put her hand on his arm. "He looks like you," she said. He looked down at the baby, who had dark hair and was squinting in the way of new people encountering light for the first time. "He looks like a baby," he said. "He looks like you," she said firmly, and closed her eyes, and he sat on the edge of the bed holding his son with the lamplight around them and the cottonwood outside, and the entire enormous improbable fact of his life precisely as it was. And he thought of a stagecoach arriving on a Tuesday afternoon, and a young woman stepping down with nothing in her hands but a worn Bible and a courage she was trying hard not to show. He thought of what he had said to Reverend Marsh on their wedding day. "She arrived with that Bible, and I thought that was enough for me." He had not known then how thoroughly right he was. He had not known that enough was an insufficient word for what she was, for what they had built, for what was currently squinting at the lamplight in his arms with dark hair, and a set to his jaw that suggested he was going to be stubborn, which Jesse recognized immediately as entirely maternal in origin. The boy was named Thomas Gerald Calloway, Thomas for Tom Hennessy, who cried when he was told and had to blow his nose 4 times, and Gerald for the uncle whose letter had sent Clara west. They called him Tom. Tom Calloway grew up on the ranch in the way of frontier children, with wide-ranging freedom and specific responsibilities, and the particular, grounded education of a child who grows up close to the land and to animals. Clara taught him to read before he was 4, sitting with him on the porch with the same determination her own mother had brought to the project, and he had her aptitude for it, which Jesse claimed to find surprising, and which Clara claimed to find entirely expected. The school in Redemption Creek grew. Clara returned to teaching when Tom was 18 months old, bringing him with her for the first year in the basket that sat in the corner of the classroom, and the older children rotated the task of keeping him entertained with a protectiveness that Clara found both touching and useful. By the time Tom was old enough to be a student, his mother was the head teacher of the 2-room schoolhouse, and he sat in her classroom with the particular mixed experience of every child taught by a parent, the mortification of being known so thoroughly, the private, unacknowledged pride. The ranch prospered. Not dramatically. There were drought years and hard winters, years when the cattle market was poor and the accounts were tight, and Clara ran the numbers 3 times and they still came out the same, and they made the adjustments they needed to make and moved forward. There were good years too, when the grass was high and the herd was strong and the spring calves were healthy, and Jesse would come in from a long day and wash up at the pump and Clara would have supper on, and Tom would be at the table, and the lamp would be burning, and he would stand in his own kitchen for a moment and feel the specific, quiet pleasure of a man who has what he chose and chose what matters. They were good to each other. This is perhaps the simplest and most accurate thing to say about their marriage. They were good to each other, consistently and deliberately, and with the full awareness of 2 people who understand that love is something you practice, not just something you feel. They fought occasionally because they were both people with strong convictions, and neither of them was inclined to leave things unsaid that needed saying. They fought clearly and they resolved things completely, and they did not carry grievance forward, which was a discipline they had both established early and both honored. Jesse read to her in the evenings when she was tired and could not bear to hold the book herself. She kept his accounts and his correspondence with a precision that freed him for the ranch work he was built for. He saddled her horse in the mornings without being asked, and she made his coffee exactly as he liked it, which sounds like a small thing and is in fact a profound daily act of attention. They had their Sunday afternoons by the creek for years, long past when the children were old enough to come with them and fall asleep in the grass while their parents talked. There were children, Tom first, in 1880, then a daughter in 1883, who they named Rose Edith Calloway, Rose for the kitchen garden that Clara loved, Edith for Jesse's mother, and who arrived in the world with her father's gray eyes and her mother's set jaw, and an opinion about everything from the beginning. Then in 1886, another boy, smaller and quieter than the other 2, who they named Samuel, and who grew up to be the bookish, patient one who sat on the porch with his grandmother's Bible in his lap and read the underlined verses with careful attention, and one day told his mother he thought he might want to be a preacher, which made Clara go very still and then nod with a slow smile that contained everything she had believed about the world in her best moments. The Bible was always there. It sat on the shelf beside Jesse's Shakespeare and the Worn History and the Book of Poetry, and it moved from the shelf to Clara's hands and back again with the regularity of a thing that is used, not kept. Tom learned to read from it, and Rose learned to argue from it, which Clara said was actually the most appropriate use of it, and Samuel made his private peace with it in the way that was entirely his own. Jesse read it, at times, without announcement, taking it down from the shelf in the evenings, reading a passage or 2 in the careful way of someone who is not performing faith, but is genuinely engaging with a text, and Clara would look up from her mending and see him reading and feel the warmth move through her with the particular quality of a joy you have looked at so many times that its familiarity does not diminish it, but deepens it. Redemption Creek grew and changed through the 1880s with the trajectory of the frontier towns that survived. Some commerce left when the railroad bypassed them 2 counties to the south, which was a blow, and new commerce arrived as the land filled up and the farms multiplied. The saloon changed hands twice. A new church was built on the hill north of town, bigger and fancier than the white church, and there was a period of considerable civic discussion about this, in which Clara was notably vocal, arguing that the old church had served its community for 30 years and deserved its continued function, which it eventually received. Reverend Marsh retired in 1885, and his replacement was younger and more inclined to wrath in the pulpit, which Clara held a strong opinion about and shared freely with Jesse on Sunday evenings. Jesse listened to these opinions with the quiet smile that meant he largely agreed and was enjoying the articulation of it. He had opinions of his own about the town and the county, more quietly held, but he voted in every county election and served one term on the town council in the early 1880s, and was known as a man of integrity on the small, grinding practical issues: road maintenance, water rights, the disputes between neighbors over fence lines that required someone willing to hear both sides and say what was fair. He and Clara were the kind of couple that a town builds part of its character around, the kind whose presence is felt not through drama or prominence but through steadiness. They showed up. They helped. They treated people fairly. They had been welcomed into this town, both of them, and they did not take that lightly, and they tried to be, in their ways and their abilities, worth what had been given to them. In the fall of 1889, they had been married 11 years, and the children were 9, 6, and 3, and the ranch was strong, and Tom Hennessy had finally retired from the post office and gone to live with his daughter in Kansas City, and Jesse and Clara went to his farewell supper at the hotel dining room and sat at the long table with the whole of the town, and said what they could say, which was not enough for what he had been to them, which they told him, and he blew his nose 4 times in succession, which was his particular tribute. Walking home from the hotel that night, Tom the younger was old enough to watch the little ones for an evening. They walked slowly up the main street of Redemption Creek in the fall night, the storefronts dark, the sky immense and starred, the air smelling of cedar and turned earth, and Clara took Jesse's arm and he covered her hand with his, and they walked without talking for a while. "It's strange," she said, "to have been somewhere long enough that people are leaving." "You've been here 11 years, he said. "You're one of the people who are staying." She considered this. "Yes," she said, "I am." He stopped walking, which she felt as a gentle check through his arm, and she stopped too, and he turned to look at her in the middle of the empty street in the way he still turned to look at her, with that full, direct attention that had not diminished in 11 years, that she still felt in her chest the same way she had felt it the first time. "Do you remember the day you arrived?" he asked. "Of course I do. You had that Bible," he said, "and that bag with almost nothing in it. And you were the steadiest person I had ever seen in a situation where steadiness cost something." She looked at him. "I was terrified," she said. "I know," he said. "That was what I meant." She was quiet for a moment, in the dark street with the stars overhead and the town of Redemption Creek at rest around them, and 11 years of a life chosen, and built and lived fully behind her. She thought of the stagecoach. She thought of stepping down onto the baked earth of this street with a Bible in her hands and an uncle who turned out to be ill, and a life that had just collapsed and been required to begin again. She thought of Roy Duggan in her path, and the sound of steady footsteps crossing the street, and a tall man with dark hair and an honest face saying, in an unhurried voice, "Roy, that's enough." She thought of the post office door and the bench outside it, and a man sitting there with his hat in his hands who had not needed to wait and had waited. "I was so afraid," she said quietly. "I was afraid of almost everything. I was afraid I'd made a mistake coming here. I was afraid my uncle was beyond help. I was afraid that—" She stopped. "I was afraid that nothing good was going to happen." He was watching her. The starlight was very clear. "And then," he said. She looked at him, at the face she knew better than any face on earth, at the gray eyes with the lines at their corners that were deeper now, at the jaw that still spoke of stubbornness without cruelty, at the particular quality of his attention that had never made her feel anything other than seen, and seen truly, which was the rarest and most generous thing one person could give another. "And then," she said, "you were there." He brought her hand up, the hand he had been holding since they left the hotel, and pressed it to his chest in the way he had of communicating things that sat below the reach of easy language. She felt his heart beating under her palm and the worn wool of his coat and the cold night air and the stars above Redemption Creek and the enormous improbable gift of where she had arrived. "That Bible," he said, "the first day, when you stepped off that stagecoach. Yes, you were holding it so tight, like it was the only solid thing you had." "It was," she said. "I thought," he paused, which he did when he was choosing carefully. "I thought that anyone who held on to something like that, with that kind of grip, in the middle of all that uncertainty, was someone worth knowing. Was someone worth—" He stopped, and then said plainly, because plain was his nature, "It was enough. You with that Bible was entirely enough for me." She did not speak for a moment. Then she said, "You told Reverend Marsh something like that on our wedding day." "I know," he said. "I heard you say it." "I know that too," he said and smiled. "You were very quiet about it, but I could see you had heard it." She stepped forward and put her forehead against his shoulder, and his arms came around her in the dark Texas street, and she stood there for a long moment with her eyes closed, and the stars enormous overhead and her husband's arms around her and the worn Bible at that moment, sitting on the shelf at home between Shakespeare and poetry and the battered history, where it belonged. Not because she no longer needed it, but because she had built enough around it that it was no longer the only solid thing. It was still solid, but she was solid now too. They were solid together in the way of things that have been built carefully and tested and have held. "Jesse," she said against his shoulder. "Clara," he said. "Take me home," she said. "Yes," he said, "let's go home." They walked up the dark street of Redemption Creek with her hand on his arm, and the stars wheeling overhead and the town at rest around them. And the ranch was waiting northeast of town, with the lamp burning in the window that Tom the younger had left on, because he had remembered that his parents liked to come home to a light, which he had learned by watching them, and had simply absorbed as one of the things that mattered, the way children absorb the things that matter from the people who show them. The cottonwood in the yard was visible from the road, its tall shape darker than the dark sky, and the November wind moved through it the way it had always moved through it, and Clara heard the sound of it from the road, and felt the particular rightness of a thing recognized and known and loved, the way you can love a sound or a sight that has become part of the architecture of your happiness. They went inside, and the lamp was burning, and the children were asleep, and the Bible was on the shelf, and the accounts were in their box on the desk, and the Shakespeare was beside the Bible and the poetry beside that, and the kitchen garden was put to bed for the winter outside the window, and the ranch rolled away in the darkness beyond, and everything was exactly as it was, which was exactly as it should be. Jesse put more wood in the stove while Clara checked on the children, Tom sleeping solidly in the way of 9-year-olds who have spent a full day of productive noise. Rose curled around her doll with the gray eyes open briefly, and then closed again. Little Samuel on his back with his arms out in the absolute abandon of toddler sleep, his small chest rising and falling. She stood in the doorway of their room for a moment, looking at all three of them, and felt the fullness of it, the lucky, improbable, worked-for fullness of a life that had kept its promises. She came back to the sitting room where Jesse had built the fire up and the stove was ticking with warmth. He was sitting in his chair, and the Bible was in his hands. He had taken it down from the shelf, which he did sometimes in the evenings, and she looked at him for a moment from the doorway with the lamplight warm around him and the familiar lines of his face bent over the page. She went to her chair, across from him, and picked up her mending, and the house was quiet except for the fire and the cottonwood, and they sat together as they had sat 1,000 evenings, in the good and unremarkable peace of two people who have made a life together, and know the worth of what they have and do not take it quietly for granted but carry it consciously. The way Clara had carried the Bible on the day she arrived, with both hands pressed to the chest, held with a grip that meant, "This matters, this is what I have, this is enough, this is more than enough." He looked up from the Bible and found her watching him, and he held her eyes for a moment across the fire-lit room, and she saw in his face the thing she had seen there from very nearly the beginning, the particular quality of a man who looks at you and means it, who chose you once and chooses you still, every day, in the plain accumulation of ordinary devotion that is the real substance of love, the kind that endures. "Good night, Jesse," she said. "Good night, Clara," he said. Outside, the cottonwood moved in the November wind, and the stars above West Texas were innumerable and bright, and in the house with the lamp in the window, everything was well.